Dead Space is one of my favorite games from the 7th console generation. I have very fond memories of playing this game when I was like 10 years old and being absolutely terrified. People that know me and my content will know that fear is a common emotion that I associate with video games, being that I also grew up playing Resident Evil and Silent Hill from a very young age. But it's been 15 years now since Dead Space first released, so how does it hold up? And more importantly, is it still worth playing the original now that there's a fancy new remake out there to play? Well, let's take a little trip back to the USG Ishimura to see whether or not Dead Space can still be called one of the greatest horror games ever made. Oh, and welcome to the Dead Space retrospective.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. When the blazing sun is gone, when the nothing shines upon, then you show your little light.
There's no shortage of information out there about Dead Space's development. I won't be getting too deep into it, but I will be talking about some interviews with Glenn Schofield, who worked as the executive producer on the game. He also worked as the director on another project I recently covered here on the channel, but we're not talking about that one today. Let's start with the fact that Dead Space was actually never going to be Dead Space. When the team first started working on their new game, they were actually making System Shock 3, a sequel to a game that I really need to cover on the channel someday. But one game came out early on in the development of Visceral Games' System Shock 3 that completely changed the direction of the project. A little game you may have heard of called Resident Evil 4. Say, isn't that game due for a remake sometime soon? This served as the main inspiration behind Dead Space. Glenn and the team were in love with the tight, over-the-shoulder perspective and gameplay of Resident Evil 4, and how they managed to make an action shooter that was actually still able to scare the player. So Glenn did what any good producer would do and set out to improve upon his original inspirations. What I love is that you can still see so many of those elements from System Shock present here in the final product. They never fully scrapped their ideas from System Shock 3, and Dead Space almost becomes a sort of love child between System Shock 2 and Resident Evil 4. Then there's the era of gaming that Dead Space released in. At the time, new IPs were popping up left, right, and center, but most of them just felt so samey. As far as shooters went, anything that wasn't a competitive multiplayer game like Halo or Call of Duty, or a cover-based action shooter like Gears of War, was being laughed out the door before release. And then came Dead Space, a game that completely focused its marketing on unsettling consumers and drawing them into a heavily atmospheric horror. Dead Space's story is a nice middle ground of originality and inspiration. The story is set in the year 2508, in a timeline where humanity used up all of the Earth's natural resources and now needs to gather them from other planets in order to survive as a species. We play as Isaac Clarke, an engineer sent to check in on the USG Ishimura, a giant mining ship stationed far from our solar system, along with a handful of military personnel including a squad leader, a medic, a systems specialist, just to go and check in on them since they sent out a distress signal before going completely dark on communications shortly after. Something that makes Dead Space stand out among other games of the time is that we don't play as a super soldier. In fact, we don't play as a soldier at all. While there are soldiers sent in with us on our little crew, we play as the engineer, essentially just the handyman of the bunch, along for the ride in case anything goes wrong with our ship, or if the Ishimura crew needs help fixing their own. Something that comes into play throughout the story as we need to go around fixing up parts of the USG Ishimura quite often. We get taught what we need to know to set up the plot, including that Isaac's girlfriend Nicole is a doctor who is stationed on the Ishimura, meaning that we have our own personal stake in the mission. We attempt to communicate with the Ishimura with no results before we crash into it and get attacked by disfigured monsters, killing 2 of our soldiers and leaving Isaac, Daniels, our communications expert, and Hammond, our squad leader, behind. We learn that the vast majority of the crew on the Ishimura have been killed by these monsters, and from here it becomes a matter of escaping the ship by any means necessary, and the story plays out in a lot of ways that first-time players probably won't expect. I'm not going to give a full play-by-play, but I am going to discuss the more important plot elements here for the sake of talking about what does and doesn't work in Dead Space's story. If you haven't played this game for yourself yet, I highly recommend skipping to the timestamp on screen to avoid spoiling the story, as it can be very entertaining if you don't know what's going to happen the first time you play. As we explore the Ishimura, Hammond is communicating with us via radio from the ship's bridge, keeping an eye on all the ship's systems and letting us know where we need to go to fix problems before they result in total destruction. Throughout this process, we start to learn more about what's going on here. We learn that the crew of the ship found what they call the marker while mining resources from the planet below and brought the artifact on board to study it. After doing so, it started causing innumerable problems, one of which being influencing the minds of certain individuals on board. This led to some higher-ranking officials on the ship going crazy and believing that God is using the marker to speak to them and commanding them on things that they need to do. One of these more prominent individuals is Dr. Mercer. He goes full Mad Doctor stereotype, experimenting on people, killing people, and convincing others on the crew to follow him in his religious crusade. This led to some conflict between the crew, some of them turning into crazy religious zealots and wanting to bring the marker and the glory of God back to Earth, and others trying to prevent it from happening after having seen the side effects of it firsthand. But with a little bit of backstory covered, let's get back to focusing on the events of the game itself. Later on in the game, we learn through text and audio logs of a religious organization called the Church of Unitology. This church has become the most common form of religion among humanity and believes that humanity is made whole through death. We also learn that they mysteriously hold on to the bodies of every single church member who passed on and refuse to let the public know what they do with them. The ideological symbol for this church, think like the cross for Christianity, bears an incredible resemblance to the marker that was found on Aegis 7 by the Ishimura crew. When I mentioned earlier that the Unitologists believe that humanity is made whole through death, this is where the belief stems from. The church teaches of these ancient alien artifacts that they call markers that are supposed to play a key role in the process. We learn in the later chapters of the game that the crew of the Ishimura was made up of mostly Unitologists, something that the church itself had ensured before launching the operation, and was sent to the planet of Aegis 7 illegally to find the marker that had been buried there. On top of all that craziness going on with the church, we have the necromorphs, a living, breathing infection that seeks to kill other living beings in order to repurpose their bodies into mangled, disfigured shadows of their former selves to further spread the infection and grow the hive mind. The outbreak of necromorphs is actually kept really mysterious throughout the events of the story, with hints being dropped along the way that individuals like Mercer had something to do with it, but nothing that definitively ties them back to the church or any of the religious fanatics that were on board the Ishimura prior to the outbreak. Along with slowly piecing together all of that story that I just mentioned, we have a fairly cookie-cutter story of survival and escape with Isaac and the other members of the crew we came in with. This game's story actually ends up feeling incredibly similar to an early George Romero film, with a group of survivors that act as a way to guide the audience through the story's world, with the actual intrigue coming from the background of what happened in the areas the survivors find themselves in. Dead Space also makes great use of Romero's tell don't show storytelling philosophy, and no, I didn't misspeak show don't tell, I do mean tell don't show. Romero would frequently have the backstory be told to the survivors by someone else. He did this to avoid the lack of budget or technology from hindering the stories he wanted to tell, letting the audience picture the events themselves rather than having a solidified, singular vision presented to them visually. This approach actually works beautifully in horror films and media, as the audience members will each individually conjure up a series of images that is uniquely terrifying to them, and even though nothing is shown, everything is understood, and it completely avoids the danger of degrading the story with age, as there are no visuals that will get worse with time. Think of movies like I Am Legend, movies that have perfectly fine stories, but visuals that hold them back from being as scary as they want to be. Romero's old works, and now Dead Space, perfectly avoid this problem by feeding you the backstory through text or spoken word, and letting your mind fill in the blanks. Tell Don't Show can be equally as powerful as Show Don't Tell when executed properly, and Dead Space is a fantastic example of that. Something I haven't mentioned up to this point is that Isaac is a completely silent protagonist, and I mean silent. Nowhere in this game will you hear Isaac speak a single word. Normally this is done so players are able to self-insert into a character and feel like the story unfolding around them is happening to them. But that's not really the case here. Isaac is completely his own character with his own goals and aspirations, and for reasons that we'll get into shortly, Isaac being a silent protagonist is the absolute best decision that was made in this story. You'll definitely find yourself projecting onto Isaac because of his silence, but the way that this is handled feels very unique to other games. Along the way, we end up watching our friends die, getting betrayed, and generally just being put in situations way above our pay grade. But through all of that, Isaac's main goal remains: finding Nicole. This is a goal that pushes Isaac forward through the entirety of the game, and we do eventually find her. There are moments throughout the game where we run into Nicole and have to help her out with something, and these act as little touchstones to remind the player what they're really fighting through all this mayhem and carnage for. At one point in the story, a military ship, the USM Valor, comes to respond to the Ishimura's distress call before quickly being overrun by necromorphs. We enter the ship to retrieve some parts we need to save our own skin, and if you're paying attention, you can find text logs detailing what the ship's mission was. The Valor's crew had been sent out to find the Ishimura and perform a deep clean. On top of that, every soldier on board was Spec Ops, hinting that there may be something more going on here. Before we leave, Hammond, who has been guiding us around the Ishimura throughout the entirety of the game up to this point, meets his end while we are helpless to do anything but watch. This means that out of the 5-man crew we came in with, it's only Isaac and Daniels left, and ironically, these are the two individuals who weren't military. In the third to last chapter of the game, we get taught what the marker really is. It's a man-made replica of a marker that was uncovered on Earth, that was used by the Earth government to contain the necromorph infection that was discovered on Aegis 7 hundreds of years ago. The church coming in and pulling the marker out of the planet actually ended up releasing the necromorphs. The frequency emitted by the marker intended to keep the necromorphs dormant then led the fanatics on board the Ishimura to begin hallucinating, and to believe that this was the beginning of a holy cleanse of humanity to make mankind whole again. The man who clued us in on all this, Dr. Kine, helps us repair an executive shuttle to take down to the surface so that we can return the marker to the planet and end the outbreak. We get everything set to go, and then when we meet him in the hangar, Daniels betrays us, revealing that she was a government agent planted in our operation with the goal of recovering the marker and bringing it back to Earth. We then quickly run to Nicole, who helps us remotely call the executive shuttle back to deal with Daniels before she ends up taking an escape pod and getting away. Regardless of this, we get in the shuttle with Nicole and the marker to take it back to where it was found and put the necromorph hive mind to rest. When we get there, Daniels locks us up in a room before taking the marker back to our shuttle. Then we get Dead Space's third big reveal, that Nicole is not in fact on Aegis 7 with us. She died before we even arrived on the Ishimura. Then the reveal on top of that Isaac knew the entire time. The video recording he had playing on loop in the opening of the game is the same one where she killed herself by lethal injection. And this scene is why I love Isaac being a silent protagonist so much. We get the reveal that Isaac had already lost his grip on reality before the events of the game even took place, and we can infer that the presence of the marker only enhanced his delusions by showing him visions of Nicole throughout the entire story. And I actually almost forgot to put this in, but if you take the first letter of every chapter in the game's campaign, it actually spells out Nicole is dead, further reinforcing that Isaac knew the entire time. It's a pretty neat detail, huh? We chase Daniels back just in time for this.
Oh my god!
We battle it out with the necromorph hive mind before escaping on our shuttle, having returned the marker to where it belongs, and then of course, we get the game's incredibly famous ending. No, I did not give you a jump scare warning, and no, I am not sorry. The ending, while admittedly being a little goofy, leaves us with the idea that exposure to the marker may have had more of an effect on Isaac's psyche than we previously thought, potentially leading into a sequel that may or may not come out eventually, who really knows. Some final thoughts to throw out here. Dead Space's general theme is all about conquering fear. Primarily, the fear of overcoming things that you wish weren't true but are. The uncomfortable realities that we all have in our lives. Or, at the very least, chopping up whatever scares you into a million tiny pieces with whatever objects around you can potentially be used as a weapon. Also, I struggled to find a place to throw this in, so I'm just saying it awkwardly here. I'm a professional, by the way, but I never understood what the meaning behind make us whole again truly was. I always assumed that it was just unitology nonsense. But then I realized that if that was the case, Isaac wouldn't be hallucinating the phrase when he sees Nicole. The meaning behind the phrase make us whole again is the marker trying to communicate with the humans around it and convince them to bring it back down to Aegis 7, sealing the necromorphs away again. This is actually one of the subtlest parts of the story, but easily one of the coolest once you piece it together. Overall, this is a story that wraps up all of its immediate plot threads while leaving a much broader world to explore and potential follow-up material. I said something very similar in my video on the Callisto Protocol, but this story answers just enough questions and leaves just enough unanswered that the story can be satisfying on its own, but also leave you theorizing and wanting more. The approach of tell don't show works so well in games like these because you can get the main plot, but also have so much more to discover if you take the time to read text logs, listen to audio logs, etc. I personally love this approach, and as much as show don't tell normally works for most media, this will always be my favorite way to be fed a horror story. This is, for me, one of the best stories ever told in a horror game. Even if the gameplay of Dead Space doesn't seem like your cup of tea, I more than recommend experiencing this game for yourself just for the story alone. There's more I could talk about here, like how the audio design and the environmental storytelling enhances the narrative, but we'll leave all that stuff for the presentation section later in the video. For now, let's move on to what most people are probably here to talk about, and that's the gameplay. Alright, so I'm going to make a ballsy play here, and I'm going to start the gameplay section with something that might rub people the wrong way, but something that I feel is important to clarify before I talk about the rest of the game. Dead Space is often labeled survival horror, and I wholeheartedly disagree with this classification. When I think of survival horror, I think of a slow-paced game that focuses on exploration, where resources are difficult to manage and combat is not encouraged. Dead Space certainly has elements of this design philosophy with its pacing and its open-ended levels, but the available inventory space in Dead Space is massive, meaning that I never really need to ration out or carefully plan my use of resources. Also, combat is kind of the main piece of Dead Space's gameplay loop, and you're rewarded with items when killing enemies, so combat is encouraged rather than being a necessary evil for the sake of progression. This is a discussion that I could go on about all day, but just know that I would label Dead Space as an action horror game, and that's perfectly fine. There are plenty of great action horror games out there. I mean, hell, just look at its main inspiration, Resident Evil 4. Survival horror nowadays has kind of just become a label in gaming for something that is just high-quality horror rather than being its own genre, but in my mind, survival horror will always be the genre that the classic PS1-era Resident Evil games and the old-school like Silent Hill trilogy, stuff like that kind of laid out the design philosophy for the genre as a whole. A survival horror game in my mind is one that attempts to emulate at least the meaningful parts of those experiences in the modern day. But with that out of the way, let's start where I often like to with the level design. Much like Resident Evil 4, Dead Space has you exploring a large open-ended environment, but sectioned off into smaller pieces to explore one by one, serving as the game's chapters. These areas are all connected by the use of a tram system that will take you to the next chapter whenever you've completed all of your objectives in the current one. As much as I definitely prefer something like the Spencer Mansion or the RPD from Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 respectively, these being large levels that are always open and fully explorable to the player, this approach works well for Dead Space. The previously mentioned action focus of this game means that having the player funneled into certain areas makes for much better pacing, and ensures that players who are there purely to shoot things will never really get bored. But that being said, these smaller areas are still quite open on their own, allowing players like me to thoroughly explore every nook and cranny for resources and upgrades. And speaking of the pacing, it's masterful here. Dead Space will drop you into a hub upon arriving to a new chapter to make you feel safe to start exploring. From here, you'll typically come across some heavily atmospheric rooms that start to build the tension slowly. Then you'll come across a necromorph or two, and their numbers will slowly ramp up until you find yourself in either a large arena full of them, or some unique combat challenge like fighting a group in zero gravity. Then the cycle begins again, giving you something creepy and atmospheric to give you a break, before slowly ramping the pressure up again. This pacing works so well that players will often never even realize the absolute tedium of what they're actually doing in-game. Most levels have a member of Isaac's squad talking to him over the radio, telling him that something somewhere on the Ishimura needs to be fixed, and sending him over there to fix that thing so the ship doesn't quite literally fall apart with them on it. This is something that you probably wouldn't even notice on your first playthrough of the game, just because the actual gameplay pacing is done so well that it keeps even these mundane tasks from wearing down on the player. Dead Space also features puzzles throughout its various levels, and these are, well, they're fine. None of them will have you sitting there stumped trying to figure out the right combination, solve a cipher, figure out what item you have to use, or anything like that. These are normally things that are fairly intuitive and that draw on real-world experience to figure out rather than things that you discover in-world. There's nothing much to really say about these puzzles other than acknowledging the fact that they exist and mentioning that they do a great job of adding to the stellar pacing that I've been talking about. And even backtracking feels great here because of the way it's handled. There will be a couple of instances where you'll return to a previous hub of the game for a new chapter. But when this happens, there are multiple things done to make it feel super fresh. First, some doors that were previously locked off to the player will now be accessible, meaning that there's more of these previously explored areas to discover. On top of that, when you first visit an area in Dead Space, some containers, lockers, etc. will be open for you to loot while others will be locked. This is because the locked containers are being saved for when you make these return trips later in the game to ensure that you're always still being stocked up on ammo, earning currency for upgrades, and more. This is actually a really great way to have players return to explore previous areas, and few games actually pull off the backtracking as well as Dead Space does, especially for an action-focused game like this. And you'll never have to be worried about being lost, as Dead Space offers multiple ways to find out where you're supposed to go next. We of course have a traditional map, but the special feature here is the pathfinding tool. Isaac's suit has a navigation system that can be used by pressing a single button that will cause a hologram to quickly highlight the path towards the next objective. This is a really nice feature to keep the player moving forward at all times without needing to tediously open up the menu to constantly find your way. But bringing us back to the discussion of survival horror, this style of breaking up the chapters and feeding the player objectives also flies right in the face of the genre people claim this game to be. Survival horror games are all about dropping the player into a situation and allowing them to figure it out for themselves. I've heard the classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill games described as puzzle games, not because they feature puzzles, but because the games themselves are like a giant puzzle to be solved. Action horror games like Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 will often lock the player into a certain piece of that world, tell them what to do, and then unlock the next section once that thing has been done. And as I've said before, this isn't to try to take away from Dead Space because I think that the game uses the action horror design tropes perfectly. More linear design isn't inherently a bad thing, especially when it's pulled off as well as it is here. The combat here is just so damn enjoyable that the design of the game never feels limiting because I'm always just excited to go into the next necromorph encounter or find that next item or upgrade. Which brings up even more praise to the level designers. Literally everywhere you go in Dead Space, you'll be able to find items. And I mean everywhere. The average room in this game will have at least 2 or 3, and some larger rooms can have up to 10. Every single time I turn a corner in this game, it feels meaningful and never feels like it's wasting my time, because I will always find some small breadcrumb item to keep me going. And if I don't find an item or an upgrade, I'm greeted by a swift swipe to the face from a necromorph. This sort of design really goes unnoticed and unpraised so often, but the fact that I can spend hours on end just walking through long metallic hallways and corridors and never feel like I'm wasting time says a lot about how well the level designers put this all together. Even if you find an item that you deem to not be useful, these can loop around to being worthwhile as well thanks to the in-game shop. Here you can buy all sorts of stuff like new weapons, ammo, healing items, new suit upgrades, and even this game's equivalent of skill points. All worthwhile stuff that you're going to want at some point during your journey. And this shop also allows you to sell items that you found elsewhere, converting them into credits that you can use to purchase those things that you've been really saving up for. This means that even that small medkit that you don't really need can be worth picking up and carrying around, because if you just don't use it to top off your health, you can put that item towards something like a new weapon or your next skill point to upgrade your arsenal. But the shop enhancing the level design doesn't stop there. Throughout the levels, you will occasionally be able to find schematics for certain items. If you bring one of these schematics back to the shop, you can deposit it to unlock a new item for purchase. These can be new weapons, ammo for said weapons, suit upgrades, you get the idea. This encourages players to really explore everything around them because if they don't, they might be at risk of missing a really cool weapon or the ability to tank more damage in combat.
But wait! There's more!
On top of that, there are what I like to call treasure items. These are items you'll find occasionally that serve no purpose outside of being particularly valuable when sold at a shop. To put into perspective how exciting these can be, a single skill point costs 10,000 credits at the shop, and these treasure items can range anywhere from 3,000 credits to 25,000. These of course are just another valuable addition to the game's level design that also enhance the game's overall progression and excitement factor. So let's talk about those skill points then. In this game, they are referred to as power nodes, and are often found in the environment or earned by killing a boss or a mini-boss. Each one of these can unlock a single node on a particular piece of gear's skill tree. These trees are actually really engaging because not every single node you'll spend will upgrade the item, meaning that you get to play this little mini game of trying to optimize your use of power nodes to get as many upgrades as possible while spending as few nodes as possible. Each weapon has its own tree, as well as 3 other trees all dedicated to Isaac's abilities. You won't be able to upgrade everything on a single playthrough, but as we'll talk about later, that really isn't the biggest problem because Dead Space includes a New Game Plus mode. For those not familiar, New Game Plus is a trope in games where you can start from the very beginning of the game again, but with every item and upgrade you earned from your previous playthrough. This means that if you want to max out all of your favorite weapons and abilities but aren't able to do it before the end of the game, you can still go back in for a New Game Plus run to see that dream fulfilled. It's just a nice cherry on top of this little progression pie, isn't it? And unlike some skill trees in games, this isn't a case where you'll be getting 5% damage increases with each node spent. You'll typically get at least a 25% increase to any stat with a single node spent, meaning that each upgrade is a large improvement, making the whole system feel incredibly satisfying, and just another factor that makes the player enjoy the combat of this game so much more. And now, I think it's finally time to get into the combat itself, as I've been sitting here recording the gameplay section for almost 20 minutes and haven't talked a word about combat yet. Combat is, for most people, the most memorable part of the Dead Space experience. It takes the over-the-shoulder shooting from RE4, but puts a major twist on the formula. This game rewards players for shooting at enemy limbs, rather than at the torso or the head. This flips everything that players will already know about shooting enemies in video games on its head. It sounds like such a small change on paper to just shoot at arms, legs, or tentacles, but when you actually start playing, you realize just how much you have to fight against your instinctual urges to consistently pull this off effectively. Add to this that almost every enemy type has different kinds of limbs and appendages to target, and this essentially turns into a major evolution of a sort of weak point system. And what pairs so well with this is the really smart use of dismemberment in this game. Anytime you shoot at the limbs, you can dismember them. Shoot at an arm, and the enemy has one less arm to hit you with. Shoot at a leg, and the enemy will fall to the floor and start crawling towards you. Shoot at the head, and well, now you actually fucked up. This game actually punishes you for aiming at the head, as not only will the necromorph still be alive, but they'll actually become more aggressive and flail their arms around wildly in your direction. This means that if you revert to your typical gaming habits, the game will actively punish you and remind you that you should be aiming to cut off their limbs instead of destroying their brain. The dismemberment system in Dead Space is pretty rudimentary, but what makes it feel so much better than it actually is are the weapons. Isaac isn't a traditional soldier, so we don't exactly use traditional weapons. Instead of pistols, shotguns, or submachine guns, Isaac uses engineering tools. The first and easily most iconic weapon you'll come across in the game is the plasma cutter. This is quite literally a futuristic bolt cutter for all intents and purposes, but since it makes use of hot plasma, Isaac repurposes this tool into one that chops the limbs clean off of space zombies, which is absolutely as cool as it sounds. Almost every weapon in the game has the same unique spin to it, except for the pulse rifle, which is literally just an assault rifle, so yeah, we're not going to really focus on that one. But this adds so much to Dead Space's unique identity as a shooter, and the visual effects, sound effects, and feedback that the player gets from the dismemberment system really makes each of these tools feel like a deadly weapon, and leads to some incredibly fun gameplay. Every weapon in this game also has a unique alternate fire mode bound to a separate button, meaning that each and every individual weapon has multiple uses in the sandbox. This is something that I really love in games, as it makes it so that every single weapon can be used as a response to multiple different scenarios. And the fact that it isn't just some weapons, but every single one that gets this kind of treatment in Dead Space makes it all the more impressive. To add on to the depth in the combat, the game adds an enemy very early on that will not directly attack the player, but rather will fly around to dead bodies in the environment and turn them into necromorphs. This adds a new element to combat arenas in the game because you have to juggle the necromorphs that are already grouping up and chasing you down, along with trying to prevent more numbers from being added to that horde. This is only one specific example of other enemy types that shake up the combat in the game, but it works really well and was unique enough to get a mention from me here. There are also a couple more abilities that Isaac has available. First is Stasis, which is the ability to slow down all enemies in a small area whenever you shoot it. This lasts for a few seconds and can be one of the best ways to either save your own ass, slow down a particularly large or tanky enemy while you thin the numbers, or just get a really precise shot on an enemy type that you might struggle with. Stasis, when used properly, can be the most overpowered utility in the game, and it really does add even more depth into a combat system that already has plenty. And I already used the "but wait, there's more" meme in this video, so I guess I'll just lamely say that there's Kinesis. This is the ability to grab any loose object in the environment telekinetically with your glove and throw it back at the enemies. This is obviously most useful when there's items in the environment that are effective at taking out a necromorph, such as a fuel canister, which of course, when launched into a solid object at terminal velocity, can cause some damage. But we aren't done with the genius of Dead Space's combat yet. Something that any player will immediately notice when they pick up Dead Space is that there's seemingly a slight input delay for everything in the game. And that's because there is, and weirdly, this is an intentional design decision. Everything has a tiny delay to it to subtly reinforce that Isaac is not your typical action hero. He's an everyday mechanic that found himself in an incredibly dangerous situation. This adds so much tension to every encounter, as if you want to get through without a scratch, you'll need to anticipate every movement of the necromorphs and have a foolproof plan to stay ahead with. This small, seemingly odd design choice makes it so that literally every part of the combat adds to your anxiety levels, from evading attacks to trying to aim for a leg. That being said, this feels really cool on a controller, but it translates horribly to mouse and keyboard. Something about dragging my mouse across my desk and seeing the movement happen a moment later feels awful, and it's hard to put into words just how bad it really feels. On top of that, there's an additional issue where the mouse look camera speed is tied directly to the frame rate, meaning it starts going all kinds of weird at anything above 30 FPS. For the playthrough I did for this video, I did play on mouse and keyboard, but I installed a fan patch that fixes up this issue and disables the input delay, and it makes the game feel a million times better to play. So if by some weird chance you tried to play Dead Space once before on mouse and keyboard, thought it felt terrible and dropped the game, maybe give it another shot with this patch installed. The game also includes a handful of boss fights that, while not exactly impressive in terms of their gameplay, serve as a great way to shake up the pace of the levels. On top of that, every single one of them has this amazing sense of scale. You'll never have an encounter with a boss in this game that doesn't feel like you're going up against a giant, overly mutated space alien, and that's something that has its own merit to it. One repeating set piece that myself and every other Dead Space fan seem to love is the tentacle. This is a set piece that's used again and again throughout the game to build up towards a specific boss fight near the end, where as you're exploring the Ishimura, you'll randomly be grabbed, thrown around, and dragged by a tentacle that comes out of a wall, or slithers up from down the hallway, or something of that sort. And while this looks like a cutscene, players have full control of Isaac during these moments, needing to frantically aim for the weak point on the tentacle to free themselves before being taken away. What makes this so entertaining though is that when you're aiming, your gun is going to be at this weird off angle where it's not lined up with the camera the way it normally is, just because of the way the camera is in relation to Isaac, so it makes the aiming actually really hard and a lot more stressful. These moments will bring your anxiety levels from 0 to 100 real quick before then dropping back down to like a respectable 20. It's just one of those things that adds to that overall Dead Space flair, and something that is so iconic I couldn't help but give it a specific mention in the video. There are also mini-bosses thrown in throughout the campaign to keep the tension high. The first of these comes in the form of the Brute, which is basically just the tank from the Left 4 Dead games. A large, hulking behemoth of a necromorph that will barrel towards you with the sole intention of pummeling Isaac into a pulp. Then there's the Hunter, a necromorph that can be damaged, but that will always regenerate its limbs no matter what and continue to hunt you down. This guy is essentially like Nemesis from Resident Evil 3, being an entity that makes you choose between running away to save your resources, or fighting a small bit to slow him down before running away to save your resources. There's more that I could talk about here, but I won't for the sake of brevity, and for the sake of allowing some surprises for those of you watching that are yet to play the game. Yes, I do know that some of you haven't already played the game yourselves, and at the risk of spoiling the video a little bit, I absolutely think that you should give it a shot at your earliest convenience. Oh, and I should also mention that every time you defeat a mini-boss, you're rewarded with a power node, so that's just a little nice cherry on top. This is a game that really does get better as you get further into it, and by the time that you hit Chapter 5, it'll be firing on all cylinders, and if you're like me, you'll struggle to put the game down until it's over. This is because the sandbox just opens up more and more as you go on, getting new weapons, new upgrades, new enemies being introduced. It just keeps expanding up until the last chapter of the game, and even into New Game Plus. Overall, I think that Dead Space makes for a perfect case study in how to have engaging combat in a horror game. Not only does it subvert your expectations and put you on the back foot constantly, but it also allows you to become more powerful as you progress through the game, and is fun enough that the inclusion of a New Game Plus mode is actually warranted, as a lot of players are actually likely to play it. It's well balanced, it's engaging, and most importantly, it's just fun. One thing that I have a lot less praise for is the use of zero gravity areas in this game. It would make sense that while you're exploring a rundown spaceship, some areas might not have full gravity. I love entering a vacuum and hearing the air rush out before being left with this amazing muffled sound, only interrupted by the slow beep of my oxygen meter. But my big issue is with moving around in zero gravity. The way that this mechanic works is that you can look at any wall or surface in the area, aim at it, and press the jump button to slowly fling yourself across the room before sticking to it. This allows you to walk on walls, walk upside down from the ceiling, and more, and while all of that is fun, the mechanic is just one of the few things in Dead Space that actually feels outdated. It's especially noticeable when moving through an area on a timer, or God forbid, trying to use the mechanic as a quick evasive maneuver in combat. Thankfully, these segments don't make up anything close to the majority of the game, but hopefully you can understand why when people talk about Dead Space being completely timeless, I tend to be the asshole who brings up this mechanic. But moving back to my seemingly endless praise, Dead Space has mini-games. Really fun and cute mini-games at that. It might seem like some of these are completely out of place, like playing Z-Ball, a futuristic form of basketball played in a zero-gravity chamber, but for some reason these just kind of work. There's nothing to break up the pacing and give the player a couple of minutes to relax, like taking some time at the firing range, or letting them shoot some hoops real quick. The game will also reward you for doing well in these mini-games, with all of them offering up a free power node upon completion. This means that not only are these fun to engage with just for the novelty, but the game will also give your arsenal a little power spike as a reward for taking the time to do so. I love this sort of thing in any game, and it makes me really happy that the team decided to include them here. There's just something even more special about a basketball minigame when it's in a game that revolves around chopping limbs off of horrifically disfigured humanoid creatures, you know? And lastly, before we wrap up the gameplay section, I couldn't really find a great place to mention this, so we're just doing it here. My transitions have been on point in this video. I mentioned the mouse and keyboard issues with Dead Space on PC, but the issues are so much worse than that. Dead Space has a notoriously bad PC port, from the frame rate stuttering and being inconsistent as hell if you have VSync on, to the previously mentioned mouse and keyboard support, to issues with any window mode that isn't full screen. It's really just a giant mess. While trying to start the playthrough for this video, I spent about 45 minutes just troubleshooting the game and installing fan patches before I actually got playing. And I think that that says plenty about just how bad the port really is. I'm not saying you should avoid the PC port entirely, as once you get it working properly, it is definitely the best way to experience the game, but just know that if Steam is your preferred gaming platform, it might take a little bit of extra work to be able to enjoy Dead Space. But what really brings Dead Space all together and makes it feel like one of the most complete gaming experiences out there is the presentation. This game has an incredibly strong industrial aesthetic. Everywhere you go in the Ishimura, things are falling apart, and all that loose metal and working machinery is really felt in the atmosphere. The environments feel oppressive in a way that you don't really see in other horror games. And the visual design does a good enough job at reinforcing this through its models and textures, but what really brings it all together is the use of particle effects, sound design, and even the UI design. Something that Dead Space has become pretty famous for over the years is its heads-up display. In case you haven't realized it on your own yet just from watching, that light on Isaac's back resembling a spine is the player's health bar. As you take damage, this will drain, and as you heal, it will fill back up. It's a really great way to have a health bar displayed on screen without breaking the overwhelming sense of immersion that you get from the Ishimura, but it doesn't quite stop there. That small semicircle you see next to it communicates how much charge my stasis has. Again, draining as I use it and refilling when I replenish. Additional UI elements include when you walk by an item pickup, a hologram will be projected from the object itself to tell you what it is and give you the button prompt to pick it up. And speaking of holograms, anytime your objective updates, you open your inventory, you get a radio signal, video call, anything of the sort, there's a small projector on Isaac's chest that projects that hologram out in front of him so that he can get those meaningful updates. This part specifically just makes so much sense in universe that it's actually genius. Isaac is an engineer working on spaceships, so if he's floating around in zero gravity, working on fusing metal, working with wires, whatever else he might be doing, it would make so much sense to have one of these built into the engineer suits so that engineers can get those updates without having to drop what they're doing to pull out a phone, look at a wrist display, you get the idea. Beyond even that, every tool or weapon that Isaac uses to shoot the necromorphs will have a holographic line trace projected out of the front to show the path the projectile will travel and highlight the point at which it will impact. Other games such as RE4 had these laser sights for aiming reticles, but the addition of seeing the path the projectile will travel is actually really nice. I can't definitively say whether or not this is the case, but I feel like I'm more accurate with this style of reticle. Just something about seeing that projected path makes it feel so much more natural and intuitive, and it really is something that you have to feel rather than see, but I do think that there's something going on here. There are also little readouts on every weapon to tell the player how many rounds are left before needing to reload, and again, all this stuff just makes so much sense in the context of these being futuristic engineering tools. The fact that literally every single piece of the user interface in this game is handled with such care and thought really shows how dedicated the developers were to ensuring the player's immersion was never broken. They really wanted to drive home that this was not just your average shooter, but rather that this was an immersive horror experience. The reason that people still talk about this stuff today is because of how significant it is, even if you don't realize it at first. Every time you put an icon or a readout on the screen that wouldn't naturally be there, or have the gameplay stop to open up a menu, you create a barrier between the player and their sense of belonging within the world. Even for those of us who are well adapted to the medium, there's this small, subconscious idea that these things are just there because we're playing a video game and they wouldn't really be there in real life. Dead Space aims to remedy that through its UI design, and it's really respectable that they went to such great lengths to enhance the experience in this way. But getting back to the environmental stuff, Dead Space has one of the most consistent art styles I've ever seen. I'm not really sure if there's a term for what I'm describing, so if you know one, feel free to yell at me in the comments for not knowing my technical terms for art, but everything just feels like it belongs here. Every area of the ship you go to feels consistent with one another. The necromorphs just feel like they're such a natural fit for the environment and the world that you're in. The weapons you'll use, the HUD, even Isaac's suit. It all just fits the overall aesthetic so well that it all just kind of blends together. In a good way though, like in a way that it feels like nothing is out of place. Everything in this world feels cohesively sound because it all blends so well, and all the aspects of the presentation are somehow linked back to the story and the gameplay as well. The three pillars of design are so expertly interconnected in Dead Space that the player never questions a single bit of it, and that's an achievement completely on its own. Getting into the more technical side, the lighting in this game is so well done. Not only are they making great use of accent lights, leading the player through lights, and my personal favorite, colored lighting, but they also used volumetric lighting and fog effects to give off a more foreboding look to every room. It seemed like such a small thing, but looking into a room and seeing the rays of light physically come off of their origin point, and seeing the fog and dust particles that float around in the air adds so much to the atmosphere and immersive feel of the game that wouldn't be there without it. Not to mention that it just makes such a beautiful contrast to the muted colors and metallic environments that they're found within. These effects were not commonly used at the time, as they were incredibly hard to optimize on systems like the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And their presence here speaks volumes to the dedication of the developers to deliver the best quality product that they possibly could. The overall level of polish in the visuals here is honestly just crazy. I would argue that few games have aged as well as Dead Space has. I mean, just look at some of these environments and compare them to other games that were released in the same year, like Fallout 3 and Call of Duty World at War. Now, I'm not going to exaggerate and say that if you didn't know how old the game was, you would think it came out within the last year, because you just wouldn't. but it really has aged so much more gracefully than other games of the time period. Something that I'm far from the first to point out is how well Isaac's suit design plays into the themes of the game. When you start out the game, you have this incredibly basic engineering suit with no armor plating on it, but by the end you'll have that same suit, but covered in metallic armor plating from head to toe, not to mention the arsenal of weapons you'll also have on hand by that point in the game. This is a great example of the art design reflecting the thematic shift in the story. Isaac at the beginning of the game has never been in an actual combat situation, but by the end, he's a hardened survivor who's outlived even special operations soldiers. The animation work in this game is also just stellar. The number one example that I could make here would be the necromorphs. The way that they run and flail their arms wildly really reflects their nature as horribly disfigured humans who have lost their humanity. It really feels like if the person they used to be was still alive, that they would just be in unimaginable amounts of pain. I don't know, man, just something about the way these guys move around will always make me uncomfortable, and not to mention that gameplay-wise, it makes it harder to shoot their limbs off if they're constantly moving around like that. Just comes back to what I was saying before about the 3 core design pillars just being so well connected here. Getting into the sound design though, this is my personal favorite part of Dead Space's presentation. Everything in this game just sounds so uncomfortable. I mentioned earlier how industrial the game feels, and a lot of that comes down to the sound design. Everywhere you go in the Ishimura, you'll be surrounded by running machinery, you'll hear necromorphs banging around in the vents, metal clanging from down the hallway. It's just all so effective at building that tension as you move through the ship. I also mentioned things like the audio when you're in a vacuum earlier in the video, so there are things that I won't be repeating here, but there are a couple of particular rooms that knock it out of the park. There's an interview done by Ars Technica with Glenn Schofield talking about his time on Dead Space. And in that interview, he mentions this one tunnel where it sounds like all hell is breaking loose because of the machinery. He tells a story of one of their sound guys coming to him with a recording of the subway train coming to a stop in a tunnel, and how harsh the sound of the brakes were in that environment. This was an instance where this designer had just been out on his daily commute, heard the sound of the train coming to a stop, and immediately thought that it would be perfect for the game. So they ended up taking this recording and using it here because, as Glenn puts it in the interview, they wanted to scare the players just with sound alone. It's just one example, but hopefully it puts into perspective just how much care and effort was put into the sound design here, and how passionate Glenn and his team were. There are also a multitude of hallucinations that Isaac will experience in his time on the Ishimura due to the effects of the marker. The most common, and my favorite of the bunch, are very quiet whispers that will occur in the background at any point that you're playing the game. These are so quiet that it's hard to make out what they're saying, but during the editing process I took the time to listen to a few of them over and over again and figure out what they were saying, and I'll put a couple of those up on screen right here. I'm not going to get too much into the hallucinations thing, as I think that's something that should be experienced for the first time on your own, but I wanted to note them here because these are some really cool moments that add to the story and to the presentation both through visuals and sound design a lot throughout the game. And as an amazing self-tribute of sorts, you'll be able to find members of the dev team everywhere in this game. There's a ton of promotional material for various products strewn about the game's environments, and practically every single person you'll see in one of these advertisements is a developer from the game. My personal favorite one is in the beginning of Chapter 6, where you can see Glenn Schofield scanned into the advertisement for various farm products grown on the Ishimura. I've jokingly referred to Glenn as the tomato guy for years, simply because of this one advert on the wall here, where he is holding a tomato. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who finds a lot of entertainment in these little Easter eggs, and if you're someone who gets a similar value out of that sort of thing, then you're gonna get so much in Dead Space. Overall, if you have any sort of interest in horror games or media, I cannot recommend Dead Space enough. If you couldn't gather it from the rest of the video, the amount of love and care that went into this game from the developers is absolutely insane. This game is not only a case study in engaging horror, but also in what can happen if you give a small studio a decent budget and enough time to work on a project that they're truly passionate about. The horror in the game is treated respectfully, rather than just defaulting to shitty jump scares that bombard you left and right. And on top of that, at the time of making the video, a copy of this game will retail you about $20 USD, meaning that it's pretty cheap to pick up even at full price. You could wait for sale and get this to like $10, even less. So I recommend the game even more given the price point of it. I normally don't give number scores to games all that much, but I enjoy doing it in the Callisto Protocol video, so I think that I might keep doing it at least for a little bit just to see how much I like it. Keep in mind that these scores are subject to change, as my opinion on each game will over time evolve and my personal preference in games and other media change over time. But for now, I'm going to give Dead Space a very strong 8.6. While I may not consider it survival horror, it's one of, if not the very best action horror game on the market. Everything from the presentation to the engrossing story to the brilliantly designed gameplay, this game is just a once-in-a-lifetime experience for horror game fans. And all of that is why I consider Dead Space to be the perfect case study in engaging horror. Well guys, thanks for tuning in. This video took a really long time to pull together, so I really appreciate every single one of you guys that watched it, especially if you got all the way to hear this part. As some of you probably gathered, this is the first video in my Dead Space retrospective, meaning that I'm currently planning on making a video for every single mainline entry in the franchise. Some of you may have wondered why I didn't touch on the remake of the original game much in this video, and that's because the remake is going to be getting its own dedicated video after the original trilogy. So more than likely, Dead Space 2 will be the next of these large video projects of mine coming down the pipeline. If you haven't done so already, leaving a like on the video would really help out a lot with getting the video out to more people, and I would really appreciate it. We've been working towards 2,000 subscribers on the channel recently, so it would really mean the world to me. Also, since these videos take such a long time for me to make, I would really appreciate if any of you guys would be willing to check out becoming a channel member. The memberships start as low as $2 a month, and it really does go a long way in helping me dedicate more time to working on videos like these. So a quick thank you to the existing channel members who are already contributing some of their own hard-earned money towards me being able to work on projects like this. If enough people were to sign up for a membership and start crowdfunding this sort of project, I might even take the time to work on a couple of extra Dead Space videos for things like the light gun shooter game that came out on the Wii, or even the Dead Space mobile game that came out way back after the original. But with all the generic YouTube jabber out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, and I'll hope to see all of you back here next time on the Dead Space retrospective.